Good afternoon. I am Gregory Washington, the president of George Mason University, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Russia in a historical perspective. Our Russian and Eurasian Studies program developed this 12-part series as part of a course Mason faculty are teaching on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The goal of this series is to present the work of 12 scholars and writers from around the world. Their insights help us to understand the historical relationship between Russia and Ukraine, the invasion itself, and the remarkable resistance of the Ukrainian people. Through the perspective of these historians, we are better able to comprehend the war in Ukraine in a broader context. This series is an illustration of how humanities research in a public research university can create knowledge, spur discussion, and expand understanding of complex global issues. We appreciate your viewership of this series, and we are proud that George Mason University can bring it to you. Enjoy.
Well, thank you, President Washington. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm Steve Barnes from George Mason University. In addition to today's speaker, I'm joined working in the background here by Jessica Dotrieve, a PhD candidate in U.S. history here at Mason. I want to welcome you to the 7th in our ongoing series as you join the Monday meetings of my online class, History 388, Russia's War in Ukraine in Historical Perspective, as we bring together the expertise of a wide range of historians to help us use history to better understand this war. The series is made possible through the support of the program in Russian and Eurasian Studies, the Department of History and Art History, the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, all parts of our George Mason University community. The past week has been filled with distressing news, leading to wild speculation that we hope does not prove prophetic. What appears to be Russian threats to possibly blow up the Kakhovka Dam that could lead to catastrophic flooding in Kherson, and even some speculation that it could threaten the cooling capacity of the Zaporizhian nuclear power plant. Or people suggesting that Russia's warning to Western defense secretaries of a Ukrainian dirty bomb is an indication of a coming false flag attack by Russia. All of this, combined with continued assaults on civilian infrastructure, means this winter will be a rough one for the Ukrainian population. With winter coming, it's more important than ever that we continue to support Ukraine, and I'll ask you again today to consider making donations to Razum for Ukraine, which works on the ground in Ukraine to provide humanitarian relief and recovery assistance. To further the discussion and to attempt to discuss the myriad questions we can never get to in these sessions, please join me and Professor Cynthia Hooper of the College of the Holy Cross on Fridays at 3 p.m. Eastern for Russia's war on Ukraine and its consequences for the world, a weekly Q&A. It's online, free, and open to the public, and allows you to be more directly part of the conversation. This week, we will welcome another guest, Professor Sanjog Rupaketi, professor of history at the College of the Holy Cross, and a specialist on India, who will help us to understand the impacts and views of the war in India and the global South. Finally, check out my Twitter feed and join the conversation using the hashtag RWOU. I try to share there the readings and films assigned in my class, and you're welcome to share your reactions to our weekly speakers there. Today, I'm excited to welcome Professor Yohanan Petrovsky-Shtern from Northwestern University to our series. Dr. Petrovsky-Shtern is the Crown Family Professor of Jewish Studies and Professor of Jewish History in the Department of History at Northwestern. He's also an artist. He has published more than 100 articles in 6 books, the most recent of which was The Golden Age Shtetl, A New History of Jewish Life in East Europe. Please submit your questions about his talk or about his research at any time using the Q&A feature on Zoom, and I'll ask as many as I'm able after Professor Petrovsky-Shtern finishes his thoughts. And with that, Yohanan, I'll turn to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen, for this wonderful presentation. Let me share my screen. And we'll take it from there. Do you see, is
yes,
everything?
Perfect.
Okay. So I was planning to talk about the Ukrainian wartime discourse, self-image, enemy, alien, and cultural mobilization. And before I start, maybe two caveats are in order. I am a historian in the past, and I usually brag that while all my colleagues write a book on the 19th century, then write something on the early 20th century, then go into the late 20th century, I'm going backwards in history. I start with 20th and I go back to the 16th century. But things, change my schedule and change my priorities. It is the first time that I found myself teaching about the history of nowadays and working on a book on the history of nowadays. I'm trying to pitch the book tentatively entitled Out of the Imperial Grip, Russia's war against Ukraine. I'm writing the book about something that unfolds in front of our eyes, and I'm teaching about something that unfolds in front of our eyes, which I always thought is the prerogative of the poli-sci people, of the journalists, but not of real historians. Now I am finding myself in the situation, which is very unusual. So if I do things not according to what you think historians of nowadays are doing, please be merciful. So let me start with this. Before we discuss how Ukrainians present themselves, how they see themselves, how they want to be understood, how they understand themselves through the war and in the war and due to the war, I need to tell you that we are dealing with a very interesting situation. Perhaps this is the first military conflict, a major war happening in the world, where we learn about the geography of the war, about the tactics of the war, about what is unfolding on different sides, about the plans of everybody involved, and about minute per minute situation at the front within minutes, if not seconds, after things happen. That is something very unusual, because there is massive information that you have to digest. And of course, we are dealing with a situation when none of the information which is presented to us is final, is trustworthy, and is something that we should take without a grain of salt. Everything has to be taken with a grain of salt, especially since every journalist, every politician, every poli-sci pundit has his or her stakes in what is going on, and a historian who has to be objective has to evaluate things from different perspectives. So I start my day basically spending 45 minutes to an hour looking through Polish, German, British, Ukrainian, Russian, Israeli, American sources, talking about the war in 7-10 languages, and really digesting and filtering the information, right? And then saying, this is what they say, this is what I think. So that kind of critical approach to what is there is extremely important. So this war makes everybody into a comparativist, right? It is impossible to watch just one source and say, I know what's going on, I saw CNN, and this is what they say. No, it doesn't work that way. So we have to constantly balance what we see from different sources, what we hear from different mouthpieces against our own understanding, our own critical views, and our own vision of history, culture, religion, society of Ukraine. Also, we have to take into consideration that most journalists, not all of them, but most journalists that are reporting about the war in Ukraine have not taken classes at George Mason University with Serhiy Plokhy or Stephen Barnes or Yohanan Petrovsky-Shtern. So they think they know what they're talking about. In most cases, they don't. So they do need this historical background. I would not be able to provide you with historical background. You have other people who do that. I would like to talk today about what is going on in the realm of discourse. So the realm of discourse is very different in Russia in comparison to what is going on in Ukraine. Putin's administration basically banished the last liberal democratic media outlets from Russia. Dozhd, Meduza, Echo Moskvy, and other radio and TV stations are no more broadcasting to the Russian people. So the only basic information that the Russians are getting, or they are getting through the state-controlled television, and you have major folks, very visible, extremely vociferous anchors who are all the time on the screen. We are talking about Skabeeva, Solovyov, and others, and they are kind of the mouthpieces of Putin's propaganda. And this Putin's propaganda is number one thing that we have to think about when we talk about Ukrainians presenting themselves in a different mode to the world, because this is the background and against which Ukrainians have to argue who they are and what they are fighting for. So Putin's propaganda and Putin's media on the internet and on the TV and the radio have been quite convincingly kind of inculcating the idea that Ukrainian and Russian people are one, that they had always been together, that these two people are brotherly people, that that Ukrainians have always been looking up to the Russians, and Russians have been the Ukrainian for the Ukrainians this big brother, always embracing and always caring and always defending Ukrainians, and Ukrainians were kind of a little sister out there. Always kissing up to the big Russian brother. This kind of a discourse about the eternal love of Ukrainians and Russians, which is absolutely ahistorical and ignores basic points of contention that one can clarify, talking about Ukrainian history over the last 300 years. In addition to that, over the last 2-3 years, the discourse changed to more aggressive stance. Putin's propaganda, especially his anchors on the TV, are saying that actually after the collapse of communism in 1991, those lands that became the lands of Ukraine were actually stolen from Russia. These had been always Russian lands. Now Ukraine kind of appropriated them, and they do not belong to Ukraine. So Russia is good to go into Ukraine and grab whatever it belongs to it, because it does, according to their vision of history, belongs to Russia. So Ukraine kind of stolen Russian territories. And of course, Ukrainians who resist this idea and who are saying, no, there is such a country as Ukraine, there is such a language as Ukrainian language. I hope you spoke about that with Professor Plakhy, because this is his bread and butter. They are saying this resistance, these claims are illegal because there was never a Ukrainian nation as a separate nation, no Ukrainian language as a separate language. It could always be considered kind of a southern dialect of the Russian language. And those people who are saying there is Ukrainian nation, there is Ukrainian independent state and with a sovereign idea, and there is a language and a national group and a culture, these people are fascists. They are going against the great Russian people. The resistance, cultural resistance, military resistance to the Russian domineering role in that part of the world is illegal and nonsensical. So Russians are coming to Ukraine to remove the quasi-Nazi government in Kiev and let all other Ukrainians get into one big embrace with Russians. That was the conversation, the discourse, before February 24th. 2022, and this discourse has become very much sophisticated today, much more detailed, but it did not change. right? So the conceptualization of Ukraine as a failed country, as a non-country, Ukrainians as people who do not exist as a nation, Ukrainian language that is not a language, and those who are opposing these ideas are the Nazis, is very much there. And this is the idea with which a regular, an ordinary Russian soldier goes to fight in southern or southeastern part of Ukraine. This is what is inculcated in their heads. And when you are talking to the soldiers that are captured at the front, Russian soldiers, this is what they say. They came to Ukraine because, you know, Ukraine is ruled by Nazis. They need to liberate Ukrainians from the Nazi rule. So that is something that we can call the Russian discourse. What I'll be presenting to you today is very different from this discourse, not only conceptually, ideologically, and from the point of view of basic ideas, but also because it is spread differently. It is generated differently. In Russia, we have kind of vertically oriented ideas that are channeled to 150 million people who are gluing to the television. They are not on TikTok. They are not on Zoom. They are not on YouTube. Many of these outlets are simply prohibited to be watched or simply shut down in Russia. They get the information from the TV. So people joke that Russia is a country which has not the pravoslavie, that is to say, Eastern Orthodoxy as a creed, but that has televizia, so television, kind of the god for the Russians, the major outlet from which you get all the information and all the final truth. It's kind of a Russian Bible, Putin's controlled television. Nothing like that is attested in Ukraine. Situation is quite different in Ukraine. And what I would like to show you how Ukrainians present themselves and think about themselves in the streets of the cities, in the gatherings of young people, when they exchange jokes on the internet, when they present themselves on the TV. So unlike this vertically channeled information in the Russian Federation, in Ukraine, you do have this wonderful opportunity to see things produced on the grassroots level by independent groups, by individuals. And all of that also can create quite an interesting picture, but it is a very different type of a picture. And we have to take into consideration that it is formed differently and it functions differently. So let me take you to the streets of Odessa. You go in the center of this very much Russian-speaking town that Putin was thinking they will capture in a couple of days because everybody there hates Ukraine and wants to be under Russian Federation. And you get across this kind of a poster. I'm looking at this poster and I smile because what it has three anchors. And of course, anchor is the symbol of the port city. Odessa was established as a port city on the basis of three Cossack villages in 1794 and developed as a very major Russian port city, Porto Franco. And you have three anchors, big deal. So what? Look at these anchors. One of them on the right upper hand side is formed as if it is a cross on the Eastern Orthodox Church with a slanted line that you see on the crosses of Eastern Orthodox churches, Pravoslavные Церкви. The lower one has a crescent as on the mosques. And the right one is shaped in the form of the menorah, the Jewish symbol of Hanukkah and of Jewish tradition. So what is the inscription there? В Одессе все свои. Literally, nobody is alien in Odessa. The message, of course, is that Ukraine, is not a Nazi country that humiliates ethnic minorities. The message is that Ukraine is a multi-ethnic country, and Odessa, a Russian language city, is different because it considers everybody, a person of any kind of creed, any kind of faith, any kind of religion, as one of its own. В Одессе все свои, ours. As Mowgli used to say in Kipling, you and I, we are the same blood. So the message here is that you Muslims, you Jews, and you Russian Orthodox, we are of the same blood. So this kind of posters of different sort of, not necessarily this one, you do see across Ukraine. So Ukrainians are sending this important message: we are not the Nazis. We do not deprecate, we do not discriminate against anybody on the basis of language, race, or ethnicity. However, Ukrainians see the Russian troops, not necessarily Russians as the people, because that'll be a more complex language, more complex question to elucidate, but Russian troops. Ukrainians see Russian troops as definitely the Nazis. Not only because the Russians, for the reason I cannot explain, are using two Nazi symbols. The letter V, that is to be seen on the SS uniform 1943, 1944, or the letter Z that you'd also see on the Nazi war machines of the Second World War. So Russians are using the symbols to mark their military vehicles. But it's not only the symbols that make Ukrainians think that Ukrainians are under attack, and those people, those enemy aliens that attack them, are really the Nazis. There are some other things that reinforce this parallel, and these other things are, of course, what Russian troops are doing in Ukraine. So look at the left-hand side with this picture of the Nazi atrocities in Auschwitz, in Oswiecim, the picture of 1945, and the below is the Olenivka picture, which was taken in 2022. Olenivka was a big barrack where the Russians were torturing the Ukrainian WOPs, and then in order to get rid of them, they just tie these people to the bunk beds and then blew the entire building. So this is how Russians behave toward the POWs. So Ukrainians are making this important parallel between the Nazi atrocities against the Jews and the Russian atrocities against the Ukrainians. Russian troops burning the school books on Ukrainian history. And in the book, right in the center, I hope you see my cursor, right here. It says Historia Ukrainy. So it's a book on Ukrainian history, and these books are burnt, right? It's not only about erasing Ukrainian history, erasing Ukrainian language, not acknowledging the right of the nation to exist. It's also the attempt of the Russians to absolutely erase the cultural memory of what Ukraine had been or is about, the cultural memory which is embedded in the textbooks, in the primers for schools and colleges. All of that is taken from the libraries and burnt. Also, it reminds us of multiple scenes of burning books of Thomas Mann, Henry Heine, Bertolt Brecht in the Third Reich after December 1933. You know what? The picture that you see on the right-hand side is a striking one, and I'll tell you why it strikes me more than anything else. Not only because Odessa is the town when my father was born in 1932, not only because those sacks of sand and anti-tank devices surround one of the most beautiful buildings in Odessa. This is the Vienna-esque famous Odessa Opera House, one of the best opera houses in Europe, but also because in mid-September, I went to Ukraine for a couple of days, And I was in Lviv, about 900 kilometers to the northwest from Odessa, and I saw the same scenes. All the universities, all the museums, all the governmental buildings, from the first floor up to the ceiling of the first floor, up to the floor of the second floor, were covered. The windows and the first floors were covered with sacks of sand to prevent them from being ruined during the Russian bombings, during the shelling with which Russians are constantly, daily threatening the historical sites of Ukrainian cities. So looking at this picture, I can tell you that I saw that, I felt that, I was standing next to that, and it is very impressive because it does bring in your memory for people who lived through the Second World War, and for people who teach that particular period of time, the images of the Second World War, of the Nazi invasion, of the same cities of Mariupol, Kherson, Kharkiv, Kiev, Odessa by the Nazis. Of course, you would tell me what many of my colleagues are saying, Yohanan, the comparison of Russians to the Nazis and especially Ukrainians to the Jews is a wrong comparison. Why so? Because it doesn't hold water, and you can amass historical information about that. When Mr. Zelensky was talking to the Israeli Knesset members, making this parallel, and when rank and file Ukrainians are sending these pictures with a parallelism between Ukrainians and Jews, Russians and the Nazis, they have a different message. Of course, they know that Jews were extraterrestrial people, extraterritorial people during the Second World War. They had nobody who would protect them. They had no democratic institutions that would be interested in taking them under their aegis. And Jews were kind of disinherited by every European country. So they had nowhere to go, and they were, absolutely exposed to the Nazi criminal attempts to destroy the Jewish people. Ukrainians are protected by dozens of democratic institutions. Ukrainians are helped by the entire world, and the entire world stands with the Ukrainians. With some exceptions, we would not go into that. But of course, there is this striking difference between the situation of Ukrainians as the people who have their own land and the Jews who did not have their land in the Second World War. The point is different. The point is that when Ukrainians are showing these pictures, when they are sending these messages, when President Zelensky is talking to Knesset and making these parallels, they are definitely saying, we need your help because we suffer. Okay, we are victimized in a very brutal way, and this brutality, not necessarily we as a people, but the brutality against us should remind you of the brutality of the Nazis, and we need your help. That particular pragmatic point, I believe, is something that we have to keep in mind when we are talking about the image of the enemy alien in the Ukrainian media and in the Ukrainian streets. Let me tell you something funny. Because, of course, the wit and humor is what is very much a huge part of the Ukrainian war discourse that you see on all levels of public and private discourse today in Ukraine. Russians are saying there is no such language as Ukrainian. Ukrainians are using this deprecating attitude of the Russians toward Ukrainian language to mock their enemy in the most efficient way. Of course, in the first days of the war, it became clear that Ukrainians do understand Russian and they do know Russian language, but they speak Ukrainian in addition to that. Russians do not know Ukrainian language, think it doesn't exist because that's what they were told by Putin propaganda, and they are going into Ukraine, they are talking to people who speak Ukrainian. So how do you deal with the population that speaks, well, not everybody, but many, Ukrainian language? All the inscriptions in the cities that Russians are trying to capture are in the Ukrainian language. The road posts are in Ukrainian language. And what do you deal with that? Ukrainians captured a number of Russian soldiers, who were dressed in Ukrainian uniform and were trying to act as groups of saboteurs. But they were captured, they were apprehended, and Ukrainians are telling them, can you say the Ukrainian word palanitsa? Well, let me tell you this. Ukrainians, unlike Russians, do not reduce vocals, meaning that the Russians can pronounce the word just with consonants and you will understand that. Ukrainians cannot. For Ukrainians, vocal is a very important part of the word and it is never reduced. So Russians cannot pronounce the word palanitsa. Palanitsa is this piece of bread. So before you put the dough into the furnace or into the stove, you cut the upper part and it creates a crusty upper part of the bread. It's a very tasty bread, which is called, which, I was eating it 40 years ago, 50 years ago in Ukraine. It's called palanitsa. So Ukrainians are telling Russians, can you say palanitsa? They're saying, no, we cannot. And when they're trying to pronounce the word, they say palanitsa. They are reducing vowels. And it is immediately clear that the person is a saboteur, that he doesn't speak Ukrainian language because he thinks the language doesn't exist. So they cannot create this. They cannot even imitate the word. This situation was immediately broadcast on the Russian television, that Ukrainians are trying to test the Russians, telling them, say the word palanitsa. And the major anchor of the Russian television, Olga Skabeyeva, used to say in public for the audience of millions of people that actually there is such a word in the Ukrainian language, which is called palanitsa, and it means strawberry. Now, I would not ask you to pronounce these two words, but this is palanitsa, and this is polunitsa. Of course, those people who speak Mandarin or Korean or Hindu will tell me it sounds very much the same. Well, excuse me, piece of bread and a strawberry is not really the same. So once this kind of funny situation happened on the Russian TV, when the major anchor of the Russian TV says, "Oh, I know what is palanitsa. It's a strawberry." Everybody started to laugh in Ukraine, and they started to mock the Russians, the Russian troops, and the Russian anchors on the TV by producing these funny T-shirts on which it is written on the top, palanitsa, which means piece of bread, and polunitsa, the strawberry, at the bottom. My wife has this kind of T-shirt. They are on sale. And of course, this is one of the ways to make sure that everybody understands Russians do not understand the Russian language, the Ukrainian language. They do not understand that it's a different language. And we do have it. It's just the statement that this language does exist. So this palanitsa, polunitsa joke is I would say, formidable statement that you are saying that our language is nothing. Okay, try to pronounce it. Be my guest. Another important thing that happened is that in the visual self-representation, Ukrainians started to use pictures, references, visual images, and quotes from the famous Ukrainian art pieces of the 16th, 17th, 18th century. Those of you who know something about Ukraine probably know that there was this cultic figure. It's a folk figure, it never existed, whose name was Kozak Mamai. One of the Ukrainian Cossacks, all those, Cossacks are those brigands that were defending the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, later Ukrainian southeastern border, and they lived in Zaporizhzhia Sich, behind the rapids of the river Dnieper, and they were basically hired by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to defend the borders. The Cossacks were at the time, I would say, Johnny Depps of the Ukrainian steppe. The Cossack Mamai was one of the cultic figures of the Cossacks, who was a warrior. So you see on these pictures, they're called Lubok, pictures of the 17th, 18th century. He's playing the Ukrainian Baroque lute, which is called bandura, and he's also, he puts aside his weapon, his weaponry, and he sings epic songs about great Ukrainian past. Now, Cossack Mamai became a cultic figure today in Ukraine in self-representation. Ukrainians are evoking their historical past by saying we are as brave as Cossacks of the past. Look at left-hand side, classical folk image of Cossack Mamai, who is with his bandura, with his Ukrainian Baroque lute, but it actually has a shape of anti-aircraft defense system, right? This is kind of HIMARS that defends Ukraine. So this is what the Cossack is doing, defending Ukrainian skies from the Russian aircraft. Or again, Cossack Mamai, who heard something in the background, and he says, oh, it's probably Bayraktar, that is to say, the drone, which is given to, which is provided by Turkey to the Ukrainian troops, which put down another Russian helicopter. Most importantly is to understand the picture in the middle. The famous late 19th, early 20th century Russian and Ukrainian painter Ilya Repin, one of the kind of Russian greatest painters of all times, has this painting which is called Zaporizhia Cossacks writing a letter to the Turkish Sultan. And it is the letter that mocks the authority, that shows Cossacks as, not necessarily very intellectually advanced people, but they are, of course, brigands and brazen people, and they are wanton warriors, and they are fearless, and they are not afraid to challenge Turkish Sultan himself. And look who is the scribe who is writing the letter. This is President Biden, who is one of the Cossacks. He is seen as one of the Cossacks, so he's kind of co-opted into the Cossack milieu. So the Cossacks, of course, are representing Ukrainians. President Biden is one of us. So we are together writing a letter to the Turkish Sultan, but of course, Turkish Sultan is no more in Turkey. He is in Kremlin, and we are challenging him together. So that kind of evocation of Ukrainian Cossack past is something that helps us to understand what is going on with the soldiers on the front. How do they see themselves? They see themselves as modern-day Cossacks, as the legitimate heirs to Cossack Mamai, who are the bards and who are the warriors, and who are helped by American president himself. Now, another thing that is very important is that, of course, the world today discusses whether to give Ukraine this troops, this weaponry, whether Germany should send armored vehicles and especially tanks to Ukraine, what France should be or should not be sending to Ukraine, whether Ukraine should or should not be in the European Union, and so on and so forth. All these conversations, whether Ukraine is or is not part of Europe and of the world. Ukrainians found the answer to this question, and they know the solution, and they present this solution to themselves and to the world. So on this left-hand picture, you see hundreds of this kind of pictures on Ukrainian internet, and also in not only in visual but also in verbal form among Ukrainian journalists and policy pundits and Ukrainian politicians. This kind of an image is on the mind. So the barbarians under the Russian flags who are attacking Ukraine, UA stands for Ukraine, right? And Ukraine emerges as the bastion or as a buffer zone between the barbarians and European civilization. And European civilization, all those outmoded 18th century people are looking at what is going on there. These people are fighting, interesting. So, let me bring my wife and we'll see together what's going on. So this kind of they are very close, these people on the left-hand side, but they are distancing themselves and they're saying, oh yeah, Ukrainians are there fighting for us, very interesting. But Ukrainians do fight, and you see that they are presenting themselves as the Cossacks. So the Cossacks fighting the barbarians, defending, protecting Europe and European values. That is something that Ukrainians think about themselves, whatever Europe and European Union thinks whether Ukraine should or should not be part of Europe. Ukraine sees itself as not only part of Europe, but as the buffer zone that defends Europe from the onslaught. And if we remember the name, the title of the book of Sergei Plokhy, who presented before you his major ideas, and he wrote this famous book, The Gates of Europe, the gates can be turned this or that way, right? So Ukrainians are trying to close the gate to the attack from the east and open the gate to the west. It doesn't work. It doesn't work necessarily and always, but this is what Ukrainians are hoping to become part of Europe. And of course, again, you cannot deal without a grain of a joke. Ukrainians also see themselves as people who are able to stand for themselves and to act on their own volition, and they are good at that. Chuck Norris is calling Vladimir Zelensky on this meme, and is telling him, Volodymyr, this is Chuck, meaning, I'm Chuck Norris. You know who I am? I can come and redeem you. I can come and save you. And President Zelensky says, how can I help you, Chuck? That is a very important message. I would not, decipher it for you. I believe it is quite clear what's the message here. But this is also something that we have to understand about Ukrainians. They are fighting a very bloody war. On daily basis, I'm opening my Facebook and I see that this student of mine from Dnipro, this colleague of mine from Kiev, this belly dancer from Lviv, this historian from Ostrog perished at the front. Distinguished people, promising people. I do start my day with just trying to pull myself together, reading through these lists of colleagues and friends who are no more there. But Ukrainians are standing, and they are standing up to this bloody onslaught. Now, in the midst of all of that, of course, Ukrainians are presenting themselves not only as people who defend Europe, but also people who have some deeper understanding of what Europe and the world can do for them. Let's look at the right-hand side, where you have Mel Gibson explaining to Jim Caviezel, who performs Jesus in the famous movie Jesus' Passion, how to play his role. And of course, Caviezel is all covered in blood. He is tortured by Romans. He is the embodiment of the passions. And Mel Gibson is, well dressed, with his haircut, with his smile of a multimillionaire. And the inscription in Ukrainian says, NATO explains to Ukraine why it cannot cover the sky over it, right? So Ukrainians really suffering enormously, and discussing whether to cover or not to cover Ukrainian sky, where there are dozens of Ukrainian people who are daily under the shelling and bombing of the Russian aircraft and Russian missiles, is a little bit of a cynical stance. And this Western cynicism Ukraine is pointing to internally and externally. On the left-hand side, here you have a picture. Actually, it's a moment from the famous Ukrainian movie of the 1950s, based on the fairy tale of the famous Russian writer of Ukrainian descent, Nikolai Gogol. It's about a Ukrainian girl from the village of Dikanka who told her boyfriend, Vakula, who was a smith, that she wants a gift from him, and only if he brings her this gift, she will marry him. And Vakula says, what is the gift? And she says, I would like cherevichki, the shoes of the empress. So Vakula has to bring her the shoes of the empress herself. He does that in the fairy tale. I would not go into that. But here, Ukrainians are kind of rethinking what actually this young girl is saying. She says, I do not need Zarina shoes any longer. Better bring me the projectiles for HIMARS rocket launchers with 300 miles range, right? Because America gives Ukraine only 70-mile range launchers that cannot actually reach to the places where Russian Tu-95 and Tu-160 bombers are located. So she wants projectiles from the United States, and Vakula has to go and get them. So these kind of understanding of who Ukrainians are and what they can get and what the West should do for them is constantly on the mind of Ukrainians, because they can really defend the country in the trenches, but they cannot defend the civil population daily bombed by the Russian bombers, by the Russian missiles. And of course, the horror of the war is also portrayed by Ukrainians in thousands of documentary photos. You will see them online, CNN produces them, and they are extremely brutal. What is important for me that Ukrainians are constantly reworking the imagery of the Western culture in order to tell their own story. Take a look at these three paintings. So you have on the left-hand side, famous Vermeer's 17th century Dutch painter canvas, the girl with a pearl ring, and in the center, right here, the famous drawing by by Munch, which is called Scream, and on the right-hand side, you have the famous Belly Dancers Club painted by Degas. What Ukrainian regular internet users are doing, they are rethinking how you can present what is happening in Ukraine. So the ballerinas appeared here amid the rubbles of the Mariupol local opera and ballet theater. Putin is screaming, seeing how Ukrainians are destroying his troops. And of course, this picture, horrible picture, it's actually a real person whose photo is taken here and placed instead of this beautiful Vermeer girl to show that this is what Russia does to Ukraine. But if you read these pictures, you will see it's not only what Russia does to Ukrainians, it's what Russia does to European culture, to European art, to European people, to European values in general. This is the hidden message. You do not get it momentarily, but if you ask yourself, what is on this picture? Yes, Ukrainian lady who was wounded during the war, and you have her photo instead of Vermeer. What's the message? What's the meaning? Start asking yourself when you see these pictures, what is the broader meaning of that? And I read it as an attempt to show that Ukrainians are suffering not only as people. The entire system of European values is suffering because of the Russian onslaught. And of course, in this particular situation, Ukrainians are continuing the legacy of the fight for freedom and the fight for liberalism, for democratic liberal values that started in the United States in 1775. So you have here the Statue of Liberty that is actually helping Ukrainian member of resistance to throw his Molotov cocktail, to burn his Molotov cocktail that would then be thrown against the Russian tank. And here you have the Ukrainian coat of arms on the yellow bluish label of the bottle of, which is now filled with kerosene and will be used to resist the Russian tanks. And of course, Russian tanks are not threatening only Ukraine. If Ukrainian piece of a domino falls, God forbid, there will be then the turn of Georgia and of Moldavia and of Finland. So Putin would not stop in Ukraine. It is not something that people were thinking about in February, right? Especially since Putin announced that he's interested only in limited operation in eastern Ukraine, and actually started the war against the entire Ukrainian territory, bombing the areas around Ivano-Frankivsk, Chernivtsi, and Lviv, about 1,000 miles off the region that he claimed he came to protect. So Ukrainians do understand that they are protecting Georgia and Moldavia and Finland and Eastern Europe, because Putin is saying the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century has been the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he, a redeemer, quasi, is coming to fix the problem. He's coming to restore the Soviet Union. Well, you know what? The news of the restoration of the Soviet Union comes as a package deal. If you restore the Soviet Union, you need to come to control Eastern Europe. So Romania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, part of Finland, and of course Eastern Germany and Hungary and Bulgaria, all of that had to be returned under the Russian control, because this is what on Putin's geopolitical mind, and this is what his what people who surround him, such as Kovalchuk or Dugin, are constantly putting in his ears. You are a redeemer who came to bring back the greatness of Russia. Ukrainians understand that. They do not need me to tell them that. Ukrainians understand that on all levels. You have people on the TV, people on the radio, ordinary journalists, but also ordinary soldiers. There is a very high level of awareness of what is actually going on and how to understand the invasion among Ukrainians. So these pictures are not necessarily, something that highbrowed IT person created and put online. No, these messages are on minds and hearts of Ukrainians. Stephen, how much time do I have? Because my watch is blocked.
We're at about 10 minutes before the hour.
Okay, excellent. So a couple of last things that I would like to show you, of course, how Ukrainians see their own leadership. There is the entire folklore that was produced by the invasion, and this folklore is extremely interesting thing to study because it represents what Ukrainians on the ground are thinking. So there is this joke that Zelensky calls Putin and tells him, "Would you like a joke?" Putin says, "Yes." Zelensky says, "Kyiv." Putin says, "I didn't get it." Zelensky says, "That's exactly what I mean." So that's a nice pun, but it shows that Zelensky is not afraid to challenge Putin, and Putin is afraid to talk to Zelensky. Zelensky, as you know, is already a hero in the Western media, and I believe the book about him, the biography about him, not really critical, but kind of complimentary, I would write it differently, appeared on the book market, but Ukrainian folklore has it differently. What are the 4 things that are seen on Earth from cosmos? So 4 things: the pyramids in Giza, the Grand Canyon, the Niagara Falls, and the balls of President Zelensky. And that is how the Ukrainians are presenting President Zelensky, who is kind of Judas, biblical Judas and David at the same time, and he is here appearing with a cut off head of Mr. Putin, with Yanukovych, former Ukrainian president, banished from the country, and Peskov, the speaker of Putin, and Medvedev, the right hand of Putin, and Lavrov, the minister of foreign affairs of Putin. They are all making selfies with Zelensky. I can go on. I would like to stop here, just showing you a couple of pictures that I believe do not need any kind of explanation. They are self-explanatory. And I would like to summarize by saying that in this wartime discourse, Ukraine and Ukrainians appear, or I would say present themselves as a multi-ethnic nation, as a multilingual nation, as a post-colonial nation, as a nation that is leading a war for national liberation, democratic war, as a democratic nation leading a war for national liberation against the imperial onslaught. The Ukrainians are people who are able to conduct mass popular mobilization, and you have Ukrainian troops that are stuffed with people who have, two higher educations, who are journalists, artists, professional historians, IT people, and they are not grabbed in the streets of Moscow and sent to the army as Putin authorities are doing today. These are people who volunteer. They volunteer the defense troops that are called territorial defense. They are trained in the territorial defense, then they are sent to the army. You have Ukrainians who volunteer to fight at the front. You have thousands of Ukrainians who volunteer on the regular, grassroots level to help Ukrainians who are fleeing the atrocities of the war and who are trying to get from the territories occupied by the Russians. And you have people who make calls, who arrange for the cars to bring these people outside of the front line and bring them as far from the front line as possible, and feed them and give them clothes and transfer them across the border. There are thousands of people who are helping the refugees, and those refugees who come somewhere where they come, they help others to adapt to the situation, as it happened with my 87-year-old mom, who was fleeing Kiev, and then she came to Budapest, and she realized that people around her, Ukrainians around her, Ukrainian refugees, are in enormous distress, and the adults don't know what to do, and the teenagers are, in their own element. So my mom organized, using her links in Budapest and Vienna, organized tours for these teenagers to entertain them and bring and show them Vienna and Budapest, to make them, to kind of psychologically adapt them to the situation and give them some respite. Ukrainians are presenting themselves as witty, brave, and fearless people with brave, witty, and fearless leadership. Of course, Ukrainians present themselves as people who are victimized by neo-Nazi imperialism. Again, you might tell me that, Yohanan, Russians are also saying that Ukrainians are neo-Nazi. Well, one thing is what one person or 10 people or hundreds of people are telling you from the television, which is practically channeling to you the ideas of one person. And quite another thing is what thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions of people are thinking and feeling without anybody telling them anything. So that is something we have to take into consideration when we talk about the usages of neo-Nazi imagery and labeling on both sides. Ukrainians are showing themselves as people who are ready to bring enormous sacrifices to defend their freedom, and they are defending European values. They are part and parcel of Western culture. They are part and parcel of the liberal democratic West. And they even say, before February 2022, nobody in Ukraine was talking about NATO. That was not a question. NATO was not ready. Ukrainians were not ready. Now, they are not talking about whether Ukraine would or would not join NATO. They are talking about whether NATO would or would not join Ukraine, because Ukraine sees itself as the NATO bastion that actually performs all the functions that NATO has to perform and that NATO actually fails to perform. And of course, Ukrainians see themselves as the last bastion protecting the world against barbarians. That is another catastrophe, another tragedy that we have to discuss, how Russians, with all their, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Belay, became seen as the nation of barbarians, and what kind of atrocities they are bringing to the Ukrainian land. Thank you. I'll stop here, and I'll be more than happy to answer your questions if I can.
Yohanan, thank you so much. If you would, you can stop sharing your screen, and folks will be able to see us while we talk. This was absolutely fantastic. By the way, just so rich and so many amazing images and things like this. I was wondering first if you could talk a little bit about, the Ukrainian material seems so deeply entrenched in so many conversations, European, but also conversations with Russia. And I'm wondering the extent to which Ukrainians are reading things like Russian Telegram, the sort of extreme nationalists on Telegram, the military bloggers, and the extent to which some of this stuff is responding directly to what they're finding in terms of Russian messaging.
Right. As I told you, we are living in an amazing world where what is here, there, what occurs, let's say, in Russia, on the Russian TV, or in Kremlin, among the Russian troops, within minutes, if not seconds, is heard, apprehended, digested, and responded to by the Ukrainians. So yesterday, one of the very major people in the Russian media, the director of the Russian television, of the Russia Today TV station, claimed that time has come to kill Ukrainian children because they will grow up and they will hate us and they will make our life miserable. So let's kill them. I remember teaching General Mannerheim secret order to the troops in Galicia, according to which the Nazi soldiers, Wehrmacht soldiers, who are not trained to kill civilians, were told we should kill women, elderly, and children because they are the Bolsheviks. So this is the same kind of a logic, and to entertain this kind of logic is one thing, but actually to articulate it to the multi-million audience on the Russian TV is the atrocity beyond any kind of measure. I don't have a yardstick to tell you how to measure it. Ukrainians responded momentarily, and they responded by just quoting him, by just reposting his appearance on the first Russian channel and saying, this is who we are dealing with. So no comments, because this is so much self-contained that such things can be broadcast on the Russian television. Yes, of course, this guy was banished, and they said, they found him a little bit too ferocious, right? So Ukrainians are shrugging their shoulders. They're saying, this is who are we dealing with. Mm-hmm. And if you do not know, just listen to that.
So one of the things I found really interesting about a lot of the material you presented is actually, again, sort of how it is precisely presenting an image of Ukrainians that is the anti-Russian, the opposite of Russia, and the way that it attacks in interesting ways, and I think somewhat subtle ways, it attacks the extreme sort of almost religious belief in the victory in World War II, in the Great Patriotic War in Russia, particularly, presenting, some of this material that equates Russians today with Nazis then, so I'm wondering a little bit sort of, the way in which they're responding to historic understandings of what it meant to be Ukrainian. Certainly some of this material seems to directly target stereotypes of Ukrainians as inherently anti-Semitic. And so I was wondering if you just respond a little bit to this sort of question of how you see this as responding to sort of certain historical understandings or historical stereotypes aimed at outside audiences, and how outside audiences think about Ukrainians.
Right. I believe with President Zelensky coming from the Jewish family on both sides, and many people of Jewish descent among the leading Ukrainian journalists, TV anchors, and so on and so forth, just makes the question of Ukrainian being an anti-Semitic country simply obsolete. There is nothing to discuss. You just show who is there, what these people are saying, what is their role, and momentarily you'll see that these accusations do not hold water. Another thing that I found very interesting is how Ukrainians deal with the stereotypes of the Russians. Because, you are teaching at the Russian and Eurasian department, right? Correct? It's a department, it's not a program.
It is a program actually here.
It's
I'm
in
the history department, but we have a program in Russian and Eurasian studies. Yeah.
Right. But Russia is kind of a central piece in all of that.
Totally. Yes.
So go to, I'm in Evanston, go to the street, the corner of Sheridan and Chicago, and ask a person, Mr. Johnson, who is 75 years old, who is standing there waiting to cross the street. Mr. Johnson, what do you know about Russia? He will say Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. I took a class in Dostoevsky and Tolstoy 60 years ago at this and that professor at Northwestern University. Yes, thank you. Ukrainians are extremely insulted and puzzled. I would say more puzzled, more confused than insulted by the fact that the people of that rich culture that has Dostoevsky and Tolstoy react the way they react and behave the way they behave vis-a-vis Ukraine and vis-a-vis themselves, right? When Ukrainians see the tanks going into their city, we have documentaries that show how a Ukrainian unarmed is going and trying to stop the tank, pushing it back. When the Russian policeman goes into the streets of St. Petersburg and Moscow, you have hundreds of youngsters who, instead of turning against that particular person who persecutes them, they run in different directions. And when they are tried to be conscripted into the army, to be drafted into the army, 200,000 leave the country. 200,000 is a crowd that can capture Kremlin and get rid of the government that basically hijacked the country from them. Russians are living, from my perspective, in the country which is hijacked from them. It's not their country. But Ukrainians are puzzled. And they display the images, beautiful golden images of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky that are floating over the ruins of Mariupol theater. Okay? And I'm looking at that and I'm saying, it's not really anti-Russian. These people are asking, you, Tolstoy, you, Dostoevsky, where are you? Where are you? This is what is happening in the country. Where are these people who are teaching Tolstoy and Dostoevsky? How you explain that? You are not able to explain what is going on. You absolutely fail to articulate what is going on with Russians who grew up reading all of that, if they did. Right? So that is what absolutely puzzles Ukrainians. And it puzzles me. And it, I believe, teaches us that we have to revisit what we actually teach within the programs of Slavic studies, Russian studies, because, nobody can explain how hundreds of thousands of people allowed themselves to be brainwashed to the extent that when an anchor says on the TV, let's kill Ukrainian children, they are saying, and I saw already the responses on the Russian media to that statement, they are saying, right, let's take this guy and put him instead of Skabeeva and Solovyov and others who, are too weak
Yeah.
and they cannot articulate really the message that we have to get through.
Yeah.
Where are these people coming from? These are people who went to the Russian schools and who read Korolenko and Chekhov. What's going on with you guys? That is what puzzles the Ukrainians.
Yeah, we've been fortunate here at Mason to have a postdoc in Russian literature and culture, Matthew Mangold, who even before February had turned his attention in the direction of teaching things like diversity, disinformation, imperialism, things like this in Russian culture and Russian media. And I think we need to do more of that actually going forward.
Right.
Stan Schroeder asked, well, he said, first off, thank you for your great presentation. He asked why this great material about Ukrainian ideas and values is not in the American media. And I was wondering if you could also use that question as a chance just to talk about a little bit, where are you finding all of these images? What are the sources that you go to when you're doing your research on this project?
Look, folks, I am trained as a specialist in Latin American literature. So before I came to Jewish history, I kind of controlled all the Romance languages. Then I taught myself Yiddish and Hebrew. Then I mastered a couple of other European languages. So basically, I get this information from Ukrainian sources, Polish sources, Russian sources. It's not the question, where do I get information? It's out there. Right. So it's not the problem to get it. The problem is to understand what you see and to reconstruct what is the message of the person or of the people or the groups of people who are trying to distribute this kind of messages and images. So this is number one. Number two, all of that doesn't reach American media because you have CNN or, God forbid, Fox News, and you have many other outlets that do talk about Ukraine. But it's very difficult to get to talk about Ukraine on American television. Do you think that, I have here the line of people from WTTW and other channels, CNN and ABC, who are waiting to have me on the television? Absolutely not. Mm-hmm. It's extremely competitive, world. I'm not trained as a poli-sci pundit. And American journalists usually go to, big name people who have a name like Mersheimer, who knows nothing about and nothing about as far as Ukraine is concerned, and they want to hear, from people who they, can present and say, oh, we spoke to this famous person, we spoke about Ukraine to Chomsky. What do these people know about Ukraine? Right. They do not have their hand on the pulse. They do not control the information. They translate to the public their own bias, right? And this is what the media wants to hear. They want to hear, your bias reconfirmed. And this is not how I work as a historian. Yeah. I'm challenging your bias. I'm going beyond your bias. I'm questioning your bias. And it doesn't make my life easy, but I am, thank God, not earning my paycheck from CNN or ABC News.
I'm extraordinarily grateful that you're with us, that we can have an opportunity to have a conversation like this. We obviously don't have anything like the reach of something like a CNN, but it's nice that hundreds of people can hear you share all of this. We only have a couple of minutes left, but I want to ask a question. It's a bit of a long one, but it's really interesting. Katya Vertis, she says, this question relates to an area I've followed though not actively studied for some time and is admittedly a very narrow point, but its implications are very interesting. My question is regarding the gendering of Russia and Ukraine in the current war, the big Russian brother versus the little Ukrainian sister, and historically Mother Russia versus the Day of the Sacred Defenders of the Fatherland and things like this. How does the gendering of the nation, particularly the shifting gendering of Russia, speak to its shifting ideologies? That is, why is Mother Russia why is the Mother Russian language being set aside now, and that language being set aside, and what does the male gendering do instead? And this is from Dr. Katya Vertis, and she also thanks you for sending book information to her.
Katya, I very strongly recommend writing a peer review article about this issue. It is not something that I can momentarily answer, and I don't know a single person, including Sergei Plokhy, Sergei Yekelchik, and Taras Kuzyok, who are able to answer this question. You have to know very well Russian folklore and Russian political discourse. Very few people follow it and know it very well. You have to see how Russians are gendering who they are. But I can answer this question very briefly by looking at historical retrospective. Starting from the 19th century, Ukraine has been presented in the big Russian literary world, in Russian theater, in Russian 20th century media, late 20th century media, as a little sister that a Russian brother comes to defend. Today, Ukrainians definitely present themselves as people who are raped, as people who are victimized, people who are not a military nation, who are the victims of atrocities and aggression of a very well informed, very well weaponized big brother who comes with whatever gender and says, it's mine. So these gender issues are not easily and not immediately available if you start reading through the Ukrainian or Russian media and finding it there. It really requires work. I don't think this gendering is that important, right? We can always talk about gender that plays a very important role in all of that picture. I don't think this gendering is important, but I don't think it's unimportant. I believe we are lacking this particular aspect. I have a couple of friends of mine, mostly from Lviv, who are working on the study of the victims of rape and sexual assaults by the Russian troops in Bucha and elsewhere. They are working with something different. They are working with the situation on the ground, with the real rape, with the real sexual assault, with the real victimization, not with the discourse. Discourse is a thing that requires literary skills, the poli-science skills, philological skills, skills of a historian. You need to not only find these aspects, but also put them in a semantic field. It's work, Katya, and I would be more than happy to use the results of this work, if it is yours, in any course on Ukraine and on the war in Ukraine that I am or will be teaching.
We are out of time. Thank you so much, Yohanan. I just want to remind everybody that next week we have a particularly special event, I think. We have 3 scholars who are going to join us from the Center for Urban History in Lviv, in Ukraine, who are working right now to document the war through oral testimonies and through online work in sociology and things like this. They're really producing materials that will be of tremendous use to historians going forward. So a little bit different approach, but also really exciting to have some folks willing to join us and engage in this conversation from Ukraine itself. Please don't forget to join us on Friday for our Q&A session at 3 p.m. Eastern time. And otherwise, I'll see everybody back next week. Yohanan, thank you so much. This was
absolutely
such a phenomenal presentation. I think one of the most interesting we've had. And we're so incredibly grateful for you being here.
Thank you. I'm proud to say, Stephen, that I started my career 8 years ago as a Ukrainian language lecturer, teacher, professor at the Center of Urban History in Lviv. So these are my folks.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll see you back next week.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Stephen. All the best.